Hey guys, if you think you're having a bad week, just be glad you didn't live through the Mongol invasion. Because while those ferocious horsemen weren't fond of reading poetry, they certainly knew how to lay waste to a city. For example, in 1258, they did exactly that to Baghdad, looting and burning it to the ground after executing its caliph. You know what else happened that day? Well, according to Father John of Montecorvino, the Mongol leader put his foot through the gates of Alexander, proving the long-held Christian belief that these gates were, quote, not so well guarded as the prophet had foretold. But let's rewind a bit. Let's talk about these gates first. In the 1st century CE, the prophet Ezekiel wrote of a coming war involving hordes from the north known as Gog and Magog. He wasn't alone. The Jewish historian Josephus Flavius described the Magogites as fierce warriors living in the extreme north beyond the Caucasus Mountains. But it was centuries later that a righteous king named Dul-Qarnayn came across this barbaric people. They were so violent that nothing could stop them except maybe an iron gate. So he sealed them away in the mountains forever. That sounds straight out of an Indiana Jones movie, but it's actually from the Quran. And like everything else, a little hard to believe until you realize this story might be based on a real historical figure, King Togarmah, or Tigranes the Great of Armenia. His empire stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian, and he accomplished the seemingly impossible, uniting the warring kingdoms of Armenia, Atropatene, Media, and Iberia into one great power. His reign was from 95 BCE to 55 BCE, right around the time of Christ. And during that time, the Roman Empire was just getting started. He fought 3 major wars with Rome and won each one. With all that power at his command, could Togarmah have been the legendary King Solomon? Perhaps. And if he was, where are the gates of Togarmah today? Well, nobody knows. But there are a few theories. First, let's consider the name Gog. It's thought to be the origin of the word Gothic. So are Gog and Magog simply an ancient warning of the barbarians who would eventually sack Rome? Not likely. There are other clues that point to a different location. Like, for starters, what does the Bible say about Gog and Magog? Well, that they come from the far north, from Meshesh and Tubal, and that they gather troops from every nation, even Persia and Ethiopia, so we can safely rule out Western Europe. What about the East, then? Well, the Romans themselves identified a people known as the Goths beyond the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't sealed in a mountain pass. And remember, Ezekiel's vision included a river of fire, meaning volcanoes. So we need somewhere hot, very hot. How about here, then, in the middle of the Caucasus? In fact, it checks out. There are 2 huge volcanoes. The gates of Alexander are hidden here, and there are traces of ancient settlements too. But wait a minute, what if they're here instead? It makes sense because the prophet Isaiah warns that Gog will march through the pass of Kinneret, which sounds a lot like this, the Kinjal Pass. And sure enough, it's said that Alexander the Great tried to seal off the pass with a wall of his own. Plus, there are legends of dragons here. Maybe not the kind you'd expect, though, like dinosaurs, mind you, no. Instead, scientists now believe these were giant lizards related to monitor lizards. They could grow up to 7 meters long and 1.5 meters tall. One was even found with gold coins in its stomach. So perhaps the dragon stories were rooted in reality after all. But we've gotten a little sidetracked. Let's get back to the possibility that Gog and Magog are waiting to break free. After all, the doors of Alexander wouldn't do much against a determined army. So perhaps they're trapped in a more permanent way. Well, if you're skeptical, you're not alone. The majority of scholars dismiss the gates of Alexander as fiction, but there's one thing they all have in common, an inability to explain away all the evidence. For instance, the traveler Ibn Battuta described a similar wall near Lake Van in Turkey, and centuries earlier, Ptolemy mentioned a wall stretching from the shores of the Caspian to the Phasis River. Even more puzzling, locals in both places claimed that the walls were built by Alexander the Great himself. So either he really did build some sort of gates of Alexander, or someone wanted to spread that rumor for everyone to hear. Again, Ibn Battuta reported seeing the remains of the wall which had been buried by earthquakes, and that may be the key to solving this mystery because there are plenty of seismic faults near both locations. So Gog and Magog could literally be trapped beneath the earth. Could they be demons? Well, we don't know, but the idea has some biblical backing. The Gospels refer to demons being locked up inside tombs, and the book of Revelation speaks of demons released to wreak havoc on humanity. And who could forget the movie Signs? In any case, it doesn't really matter whether Gog and Magog are literal monsters or demons. Either way, they're bad news. And the world hasn't ended because they haven't been released yet. But that's not saying much considering they were sealed away thousands of years ago. Still, scholars remain divided. Some insist they are just figures of speech used to describe various enemies of Palestine throughout history. But why did so many independent cultures come up with the same idea? Was the prophet Ezekiel plagiarizing the Quran, or vice versa? Well, not likely. Scholars agree that both texts are drawing upon a shared tradition going back to the ancient Near East, a land where it was believed that evil lived. In the deserts of Saudi Arabia, the Sumerian god Namu came up in one tablet after another. Sometimes he led the gods to victory, sometimes he led the enemy. But always he was associated with violence and destruction. Even the Egyptians were aware of him, calling him the Lord of the North Wind. So what was Namu up to all those millennia ago? Well, that depends on who you ask. But it's safe to assume he had a hand in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the death of Abel, and the flood. Just about every major catastrophe in human history has been attributed to the wrath of God. Or is it Namu? But what about the apocalypse? Is that in the cards? Well, it's hard to say. After all, the book of Revelation says that Gog and Magog unite their armies for one last try at world domination. But then God intervenes and destroys them with his breath, turning the mountains of Palestine into a barren wasteland. This has led some to believe that the apocalypse is imminent, especially considering Jesus spoke of it as well. However, most Christians see this event as still being in our future. If that's true, should we be worried? Well, possibly. The only thing we can be sure of is that this war will not be like any other. According to the book of Revelation, there will be an earthquake unlike any other, and the sun will turn black. Then the moon will split in two. Imagine that for a moment. If you've ever seen a total solar eclipse, you'll know that the sky turns an eerie blood-red color. Now imagine the moon splitting in two. That's quite a sight. Then there's the blood-filled river running from the east to the west. Yeah, things aren't looking good. We may want to pay attention to this passage in particular. They will go down to the ground, and their bodies will lie on the mountains of Palestine. Then it will come about in that day, says the Lord God, that I will raise up the dwelling place of David that is lost, and repair its ruins, and raise up its walls. And I will raise up the remnant of Jacob and the remnant of Palestine, and they shall again build the old paths and the old roads, and dwell in their land. It's clear that the author is referring to a new age, a new beginning. But what happens to the rest of the world? Well, that's anybody's guess. And as for the people involved in the war, including Gog and Magog, they will become a single nation, believers' greatest enemy. But in the end, believers will win, thanks to God's intervention. If that sounds like a fairy tale, just remember that billions of people take this book seriously. So, while the world may not end in a nuclear fireball, it will end as we know it. Everything will change, and everyone will die. Okay, that might be a bit dramatic, but as the famous preacher C.H. Spurgeon once said, the Battle of Armageddon is not a future event. It began when Lucifer fell. Thanks for watching. Do you think Gog and Magog are trapped beneath the earth? If so, when do you think they'll return? Let us know in the comments.